Welcome everybody to Voices of Wentworth. My name is Kath Naish and I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and by paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Last October, Voices of Wentworth held a town hall looking at the key elements of a healthy democracy, including the need for proper accountability and minimal corruption. And tonight, we're taking a closer look at proposals for a National Integrity Commission, and we are privileged to be joined by three prominent voices in this space. Anthony Whealy QC is a former New South Wales Court of Appeal judge and chair of the Centre for Public Integrity, which is pursuing an integrity reform agenda to increase public trust in our democracy. Helen Haines is the federal independent member for Indi, whose platform includes getting rid of corruption in politics. And Serena Lillywhite, the CEO of Transparency International Australia, is focused on key public sector reforms to strengthen our system of governance. Welcome to all of you. There have been many recent allegations of misuse of public money by the coalition government, which the public clearly has an interest in investigating. The sports rorts scandal involved large public grants of money being disproportionately directed to marginal and targeted seats before the 2019 election. $30 million of public money was paid for the Leppington Triangle, a 12-hectare plot near the Western Sydney Airport, which was subsequently valued at just $3 million. $4 million of bushfire recovery funds have been directed to the Liberal-held Hawkesbury region, despite it suffering less damage than the neighbouring Labor-held Blue Mountains area, which has received nothing. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on Hawkeye Army vehicles, which could have been saved if Australia had joined a US Joint Light Tactical Vehicle programme. And sadly, there are many other examples as well. The failure to hold politicians publicly to account has a disastrous effect on public trust in government and within the Australian community. This erosion of trust creates a divisive environment, impacting social cohesion and threatening democracy itself. We only have to look at the US to see what happens when trust in public institutions is eroded. Politicians can start by being straight with the public about the role of an integrity commission. MP for Wentworth Dave Sharma has previously tried to frame it as a judicial body supplanting the decision-making of elected representatives, which is misleading because the purpose and role of an anti-corruption body is to investigate abuse of power and corruption, not to review the decisions of elected representatives unless those decisions were corrupt. He has also pointed to the existence of the Audit Office as an oversight body, but last year the Audit Office requested additional funding to do its important work, and instead the government announced $14 million of cuts from its budget. So this only makes the need for an effective National Integrity Commission even stronger. I'm going to hand over now to our panellists. Anthony will take us through the government's draft integrity legislation, which the Centre for Public Integrity has described as a sham, designed to conceal and not reveal corruption. The consultation period for submissions on the draft closes this Friday, and we hope that this session will serve to inform your submissions. Helen will then take us through her own bill, proposing an effective and responsible model for an anti-corruption body which is fit for purpose. And Serena will summarise the key issues raised and highlight some aspects to consider when making submissions before we move into our Q&A session. So, over to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. All right, well look, 4 years ago, Serena Lillywhite and I appeared together before a Senate inquiry. We were there to support Transparency International Australia's push for the establishment of a federal anti-corruption body. And we were astounded when we heard the submissions that were put against us. The Attorney General at the time, George Brandis, and his staff argued that there was no need for a federal anti-corruption body because he said there's no corruption at a federal level. We were astounded at that proposition. And now, 4 years later, when we listen to the array of scandalous things that Kath Naish has suggested are occurring, we realise how infantile that argument was. Well, times have changed, of course. All of the political parties now agree there should be an anti-corruption body, although it must be said, with all due respect, that the coalition have really been dragged kicking and screaming over the line. So, but we were pleased, I think, most of us, to know that they were going to now embrace such a body. But then again, we were dismayed when we saw the model that was proposed. And now the exposure draft has come out, and we see that it's exactly the same as the model that was originally proposed. It's quite a deep and lengthy piece of work, and a lot of effort's gone into it. And it's such a shame that the same 6 or 7 things that were wrong with the model when it was first proposed 2 years ago have all been repeated without amendment in the exposure draft. So what's it really like? What's our judgment of it? Well, I think that I'm sure Serena and I both agree that the government proposal falls disastrously short of providing an effective body to counter corruption among public servants, ministers, parliamentarians and their staff. And we believe that the community will see this as a sham designed to protect parliamentarians and public servants from proper scrutiny. It will reduce Australia's standing as a country genuinely attempting to stamp out corrupt practices at a federal level. And the model stands in stark contrast to the state and corruption agencies around Australia. So what's wrong with it? I'm just going to make 6 or 7 very brief points. First of all, this exposure draft bill divides the agency into 2 separate structures, one admittedly very effective and the other with a severely limited range of powers. And really, this is, not to use too strong a word, it's really a disgrace, because if you're going to have an anti-corruption body to cover people at federal level, then it must cover all of them. And this model does not. There are 2 divisions, as I say. Law enforcement officials are strictly governed and strictly controlled, but that's not the case with parliamentarians, their staff, and the majority of the public sector. So to carve out one section and protect them from public scrutiny is really quite deplorable. And the reason that's given for it is extremely artificial. Why? The Attorney General argues that law enforcement officials come into direct contact with criminals, so they're more likely to be corrupted. Well, you know, that argument is just not sustainable. The head of the Crime and Corruption Commission in Queensland laughed it out of court. He said his organisation deals with both aspects, law enforcement officials and public servants. He said the type of corruption they encounter with law enforcement officials is pretty mild, really. It's usually abuse of power of one kind or another. Whereas, he says, when we examine the public sector, we find very serious and deeply ingrained corrupt practices. And so to try to argue that this division into 2 structures is warranted is just wrong. Secondly, criminal conduct needs to be shown before a politician can be examined. And you contrast that with a law enforcement officer. A law enforcement official can be investigated in respect of, I quote, corruption of any kind, whether criminal or not. And this distinction, of course, is once again really seen as protecting politicians. Thirdly, even if that were to be the case, that criminal offences were to be the sole way in which a politician could be investigated, then the threshold of reasonable suspicion of a criminal offence is just too high. If somebody in an anti-corruption agency hears of a suggestion that there's been corrupt practice at federal level, there won't be enough evidence at that point to make anybody reasonably satisfied that a criminal offence has occurred. You don't get to that state until you've done some investigation. But here you can't investigate unless that suspicion is already reasonably held. And the bigger point I would make is that when we're dealing with corruption in the federal sphere, Just think of the examples Kath Naish has given you: sports rod scandal, the Bushfire Relief Fund, the Leppington Triangle. They may not involve criminal offences, but they're the sort of conduct that the community as a whole would regard as totally reprehensible. Next, there's almost no ability for the government's body to investigate on its own initiative. And that's a really serious limitation. Nextly, whistleblower complaints against the public sector, against parliamentarians and their staff, are completely outlawed. Just think about that. That's a terrible situation. Any member of the public under this legislation could lodge a complaint against a law enforcement official, but not so if a member of Parliament is involved. Is that fair? Is it just? Is there any justification for it? We would argue certainly not. And sixthly, law enforcement officers can be publicly examined for their corrupt behaviour, and their conduct may be exposed in a public report. However, this is not the case with the public sector, with parliamentarians and their staff. We would never know they were being investigated, and we would never know the outcome of those investigations. Why is that? The answer, I think, is pretty obvious. The argument that the Attorney-General raises for saying we don't want parliamentarians or their staff publicly examined and publicly reported on is because it may cause unfair damage to reputation. We all agree that whatever the body is that's formed, there should be protections in it to prevent the unfair damage to reputation. But if people deserve to have their reputation trashed, well, so be it. It's not a proper way of handling that fear to say we'll do away with public hearings and public reports. But of course, the point I make again and again is that this being a too-structured organisation, you can have a public examination of a police officer, you can have a public report about his corrupt conduct, but neither thing will happen with a parliamentarian or the majority of the public sector, and that is just wrong. Finally, I would say that the government proposal proceeds on quite a flawed assumption. As Kath said, the primary role of an anti-corruption agency is not to ensure convictions for criminal offences, nor is its core task concerned with gathering evidence for a criminal prosecution. It's not a part of the judicial system. It's part of the executive arm of government. And its primary aim is to uncover serious corruption in the field of public administration and to publicly expose it where that is appropriate. To that end, it's given wide and special coercive powers. It's not bound by the evidence and does not function as a judicial body. Indeed, the evidence it gathers, for the most part, is not admissible in a court of law. That's the trade-off for having such strong coercive powers. It just seems to me that the Attorney-General does not understand that fundamental point, and those who support the government model fail to appreciate that point. So overall, the impact of these 6 or 7 points I've made is to make the CIC, I would say, a worthless creature, indeed not worse than if there were no corruption body created at all. So this proposition essentially is designed, I submit, to protect politicians and the public sector from public scrutiny. And if it is enacted, I believe corruption will flourish at a federal level instead of being alienated. By contrast, Helen Haines, who will speak next, has a draft bill before the House that really achieves everything the coalition bill does not. It's a model that's been very carefully crafted with the assistance of Transparency International Australia and with the assistance of Professor A.J. Brown of Griffith University and other experts. It's a tremendous document, and in almost every respect, the criticisms that I've mentioned about the government model do not apply to it. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Helen.
Thanks very much, Anthony. That was great. A really, really great rundown of the draft legislation. So pass over now to Helen Haines, and just let me know. I'm going to help you share your screen. So when you're ready.
Thanks so much, Kath. If you could pop that first slide up. And firstly, I'd like to thank you, Voices for Wentworth, for this invitation. I'm really delighted to join with you all and with Anthony and Serena tonight on this presentation. I'm coming to you from Bangarang country in northeast Victoria in the regional city of Wangaratta, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I am here as an independent member of Parliament, as you can see, and is relatively well known now. Indi has elected independents now for 3 elections in a row, so we're all pretty proud of that down here. So the next slide, please, Kath. Anthony, thank you so much for the introduction that you gave, and you highlighted, as I'm about to as well, firstly, that our federal government, the Commonwealth government, is indeed the only government in Australia without an Integrity Commission. So major gap that at our highest level we have no Integrity Commission. And this particular slide just demonstrates how long we have been waiting to get one. The first parliamentary inquiry that looked into setting up a Federal Integrity Commission was over a decade ago in 2010. And since then, there's been countless bills, consultations, parliamentary inquiries that have gone nowhere. The Greens introduced a bill in 2010, and indeed my predecessor, Cathy McGowan, introduced a private members bill in 2018, and the Greens again just last year or year before last in 2019 passed a bill through the Senate, but we were unable to debate it in the House. So it's clear that there's been lots of talk from the government, but for a long time, absolutely no action. Next slide, please, Kath. So the government really is a prime example of no action. In 2018, in the previous slide, I showed really that the Attorney General said he was still considering options for a federal ICAC. And just prior to the last election in December 2018, after Cathy introduced her bill, the Prime Minister committed to establishing a Federal Integrity Commission during his parliament. But really, for most of the parliament since I've been there, it's been an absolute snail's pace. And the Attorney General released a pretty poor proposal for a consultation back in February 2019. And we heard nothing about that, really, for an entire year. So in April last year, 2020, I was really tired of waiting, and my electorate were tired of waiting, and indeed I think the nation was tired of waiting. So we decided to act. And we decided to act because not only was it needed, not only had we waited so long, but I had actually promised my electorate that I would pick up the work that had already been done and continue to pursue this. So without any draft legislation coming from the Attorney General to work with, and I had been calling on him, plenty of meetings, I decided then to write a set of 5 principles which could measure any future draft legislation against. And I did that in good faith because I was hopeful that the government would come good on their promise. Next slide, please, Kath. So we called these principles the Beechworth Principles, and we did that because I was really keen to bring this whole story of integrity, which Anthony has pointed out. You know, integrity legislation is long and complex and quite difficult for everyday Australians to really get their head around. What everyday Australians are great at understanding is that we jolly well need one. They understand things like sports rorts. But to get your head around the legislation, I thought it would be a really useful exercise in engaging my community into the process of this, to start with a set of principles and relate it to a local story. And the Beechworth Principles relate to a story from our town Beechworth in the gold rush in 1853. When a young innocent miner was shot dead by police. A terrible situation. The people started asking about whether the police had abused their power. The police tried to hold a sham inquiry behind closed doors into themselves. And the community didn't accept this, and they protested until there was a fair and proper inquiry. And it was that story that we thought this relates exactly to our history, and it highlights the problem with any kind of commission put forward by a government that investigates itself without the necessary checks and balances. So it was a great place to start with writing our principles, and the principles were really simple. Really simple. So the community wanted an integrity commission that had, number one, broad jurisdiction. So everyone was subject or is subject to independent scrutiny. And Anthony highlighted problems with the government bill where there's different rules for different groups of people. And that's clearly not okay. That's the second part, the common rules. All persons need to be held to a standard of behaviour. Any integrity commission needs to have appropriate powers. So it needs to have the ability to do what its purpose actually is, to fulfil that purpose. It should have fair hearings, and these need to be held openly when it's in the public interest. And there needs to be public accountability. So absolutely crucial to make sure that the commission is reportable to the public, and that there's parliamentary oversight, and then it's not set up for private political interests. And just going back through those again, I think these 5 principles, and there's been many principles put forward for an integrity commission. We did narrow it down to 5. 5 is easy to remember. 5 though covers off, I think, on those really crucial bits. And we want to be absolutely certain that any integrity commission put forward for debate really does check off on those 5 things. So these principles really are a yardstick, and it's a yardstick that you listening can apply to measure the government by, and indeed to measure my bill by. These aren't reactionary, they're not hot-headed political slogans, they're fundamental, measured, evidence-based, forward-looking principles. Kath, if you could put the next slide up, please. Thank you. So what did we do next? We presented these Beechworth principles at the Beechworth Courthouse, which is a gold rush courthouse. We put out the call to our community, and we didn't give them much time, actually. We only gave them 10 days notice, and we had over 200 people in the hall. We couldn't fit them in the courthouse. It was pre-COVID, just pre-COVID, actually. We couldn't fit them all in. We had people up in the public galleries. We had people outside the doors cramming to get a look. So we got a fantastic response from our community. This story really resonated with them. So what did we do then? They listened to what we had to say. They listened to the call for action, and they decided then that they would lead a petition. And they gathered close to 2,000 signatures from right across the electorate supporting the Beechworth Principles and calling on the government to act. This petition was begun back in May, and well, actually in April, and then we had all of our COVID lockdown, but the community managed to still get 1,000 signatures on a piece of paper. I wonder if they kind of sprayed it down between passing it around to people, but it was an incredible effort, again, showing this is coming from the people. So I then took that petition to Parliament and tabled it on the 20th of May, and still from the government there was radio silence. And the government was telling me that they were way too busy at this point. They were dealing with the COVID pandemic, too busy to act. But at the same time, the government was legislating many other complex bills, like its Jobs Ready graduate reforms and a technology roadmap. So to be truthful, I didn't really buy it that this was a matter of this was not a matter of public importance, and that I really wasn't buying that they didn't have time for this. Clearly there was some delaying tactics. So by October 2020, there was still no action from the Attorney General on and giving us an Integrity Commission legislation. So next slide, please, Kath. So it was a full 6 months since I had put forward the Beechworth Principles and no action from the government, and I decided to act myself. And of course, throughout this period of time, as Anthony pointed out, I was working with Transparency International, with eminent judges from across the nation, with AJ Brown, and many people to put together legislation that we required. And this is a picture of me back then in October, tabling the bill with the clerk in the Parliament. And as Anthony said, these bills aren't easy to write, and this particular bill, the Australian Federal Integrity Commission 2020, which is the name of the legislation in my name, is over 1,000 pages long. It's very complex work. Next slide, please, Kath. So as I said, I wrote this bill with the Beechworth Principles as the founding bedrock. I sent the Beechworth Principles to every MP in the House and asked them to work with me on this Integrity Commission. And I really did want to cut through all the political one-liners around integrity. I wanted to write a measured consensus bill from the crossbench that all MPs could get behind. And I really think that as an independent sitting on the crossbench, I'm in a really good position to take the politics out of this, to be a safe pair of hands coming in through that crossbench and carry something like this forward. And that was the good spirit with which I took it to other MPs. As I said, I worked with multiple groups, as I've highlighted, including ethicists as well, and many legal minds. And so the bill that we tabled subsequently does include public hearings when it's in the public interest. And it strikes, I think, the right balance between the right of the public to know and the right to protect reputation from being tarnished. And when I went around and spoke to MPs on all sides of all stripes, that was the number one concern, was that a Federal Integrity Commission would be used illegitimately to tarnish people's reputations, and they'd have no way of protecting themselves. So this right balance, I think, was really important, and that was particularly in regard to the public hearings. So on that, the balance this strikes is that if the allegations are serious and the investigation is just beginning, the hearings will likely be in private. If the investigations have evolved and the evidence is strong, the hearings will be in public. There's also capacity within this bill for exoneration. And one of the things that I learnt in talking to many people, not only the MPs, but people who've been engaged with integrity commissions at a state level, was the concern that people are brought before an integrity commission with a public hearing. They're found to be completely innocent, and they never get a chance to fully clear their name. So one component of this bill is that a report will be tabled at the next parliamentary sitting if a person is found to be completely innocent, and that will be tabled and spoken to in Parliament. So they have that capacity for exoneration. So the AFIC bill includes the public hearings when in the public interest, the opportunity for public referrals. And again, this makes it rather different from the government's bill, so that anybody can make a referral through to the Commission. Full retrospectivity, I think, is extremely important. It's extremely important so we can follow the thread of corruption, and it has common rules for all. So no special treatment for MPs and their staff. And alongside this bill is a sister bill which includes a parliamentary code of conduct and an independent parliamentary oversight that can't be hijacked. It also has a broad definition of integrity, which I think is really, really important, and it is a pro-integrity bill in order to build a culture of integrity in politics. It's important, though, at this point, just to note that the government bill, while my bill is before the Parliament, it's still alive, it's on the notice paper, the government bill is not. It's simply an exposure draft. It's not before the Parliament. And it's gone out, as you know, for another round of consultation that concludes on Friday. And this is the kind of consultation that's been happening really for 10 years. So we're at that stage again. So next slide, please, Kath. So Anthony's highlighted where he sees there are problems with the government's Commonwealth Integrity Commission, or the KIC, and I'm just going to run through for you where I see the problems, and we have pretty much the same list, I would say. So there are some major flaws with the proposed Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Exclusive private hearings for more than 80% of public servants. So the capacity for a public servant, an MP or their staff, to get a public hearing is pretty remote. well, it's completely remote actually for parliamentarians and their staff, and as I said, for 80% of public servants as well. There's no direct public referrals or whistleblowing. So essentially the only people who can refer to this commission are senior bureaucrats, essentially, and that's really, really problematic. There's no parliamentary code of conduct, so I think this is a real problem. There is nothing to direct or to provide a pro-integrity culture in our parliament, and I, like many other new MPs, when I came to the federal parliament, I was shocked that there was no code of conduct for us. Every professional group I've ever belonged to in the past has indeed, at the very minimum, got a code of conduct. And the other clear flaw to me is there is a very narrow definition of corruption, the same as the courts, and that's really problematic. We cannot restore trust in our democracy if we're not looking at broader issues of corruption, broader issues of integrity per se, and Anthony's highlighted that as well. And importantly, the government has put forward a bill that the Senate has already said in its current form it would oppose such a bill. So its chances of actually progressing through the House are almost, well, they're almost nil. The Senate, importantly, have said that they would accept no less than a bill that meets all 5 of the Beechworth Principles. So if indeed the Australian Federal Integrity Commission Bill 2020, which is my bill, was debated on the floor of the House of Representatives, and if by some extraordinary vote and some government members across the floor it got to the Senate, it would be passed. So that's a key and important difference. Next slide, please, Kath. So the government's latest round of consultation, as I said, finishes on Friday. But beyond that, who knows how long we're going to have to wait, really, until they improve their flawed bill and introduce something robust in Parliament. We don't know. We don't know what the next steps are. So this could just continue onwards. And that's why it's really, really important, I think, for the media and the community, groups like you, like Voices for Wentworth and others, to be watching the government closely, to be putting forward a submission, if you haven't already, before Friday, and calling the government out on this for stalling on this for so long, and for potentially introducing a bill to Parliament which is clearly substandard. So last slide, please, Kath. So there are government backbench MPs who truly do want to see a robust integrity commission, and they're watching closely too. And I've been working with them really from the get-go. They, of course, in good faith, were very keen for the government consultation process to take place, and I agree with them. I think that was important. That's happening, and as I said, it's finishing this Friday. But the bill I introduced and the Beechworth Principles, I do believe, are the yardstick that we'll use, and I hope that they will use too, to measure any revised version of the government's bill before the next election. I think I feel really pleased that I have got a bill before the Parliament that can be used as a direct comparison with what the government are offering us. And again, I would say if the government takes too long to act, I will go back to those government MPs and I'll be asking them how I can work with them again and more closely before the next election to make sure that we get the results we actually need. And if that means that I need to invite MPs across the floor to bring on debate, then so be it. That's what I'll try to do. And I guess I would say to you that my intention with this as an independent member of Parliament is to try and take the politics out of the Integrity Commission bill. I know it is probably one of the most political bills in the House, but the Australian people, the democracy that we treasure so greatly, and the moral standards that I'd like to think we hold ourselves to mean that we shouldn't be playing around with this. We should be trying to do the best by our democracy. And that's very, very much my intention. And I think for all of us, there is actually nothing more important than that. So that's all I'll say for now.
thank you very much to the Voices of Wentworth for the opportunity to be here this evening and to join this discussion, and also to Tony and Helen, who've given such a wonderful summary and process, if you like, of both the Commonwealth Integrity Commission draft exposure bill as well as the AFIC bill. It was interesting to see that historical timeline, and I did pause to think, Helen, that, and Tony will be aware of this, but Transparency International Australia has been calling for a National Integrity Commission since 2004. So, you know, that history of the need to establish this and to put in place at a federal level what we have at a state level is certainly long overdue. For those of you who are going to put in a submission before Friday, I'd encourage you to have a look at some very recent research that one of the board members of Transparency International Australia, AJ Brown, has worked on. It's called the National Integrity System, the Blueprint for Reform. We launched this in November 2020, and there's a section there just on the Federal Integrity Commission, and I think all of the sorts of issues that Tony and Helen have touched on, which really cover off on the limitations of the model that's been put forward, really provide a good evidence base and alternative in this blueprint for reform that we've developed. And we've also got a short position paper on our website called A Fit for Purpose National Integrity Commission, and indeed also the support that we've given for the Beechworth Principles. So I think, as we've clearly heard from both Tony and Helen, the proposed model, KIC model, does not meet the necessary criteria to render it effective and credible. And really, we are hoping that the Attorney-General does listen and respond to the views that are put forward as part of this consultation process. And unless some of these sort of quite fundamental flaws that have been outlined this evening are addressed, and that's what's required to have an integrity commission of best practice. And unless those fundamental flaws are addressed, then I'd suggest that the AFIC bill that is already before the Parliament is a better starting point for the government. I think one of the key things that we've heard tonight is that there's, we need a consistent approach to an integrity commission that applies equally across the entire federal public sector. And these proposed two divisions is just not going to cut the mustard, and it's not going to deliver what we need, or in fact what the community expects. We've heard also that the definition and scope of what constitutes corruption is just far too narrow for the bulk of the public sector, outside, of course, this law enforcement division, which looks quite robust in terms of what will happen there. But by and large, in fact, the bulk of the public sector, 79% of it, is not going to fall under that same level of scrutiny. The other issue that's been touched on tonight is the matter of referrals. And again, it's not consistently handled across these two divisions. In the case of the law enforcement division, yes, it is possible for whistleblowers and members of the public to refer a matter for the Commission's consideration, but that's not the case for the public sector division. And in that case, an issue must actually first be taken to another integrity agency and in fact referred from another integrity agency to the Integrity Commission. So we're going to see this kind of gatekeeper or filter applied that really is not appropriate. So the Commission, as we've heard, needs the full capacity to directly receive and act on corruption information from any person, or indeed to initiate their own investigations. And we know that it's especially important for citizens or for business people or indeed whistleblowers. They may not trust existing integrity agencies to refer their complaint. And in the case of whistleblowers, of course, they may need to be assured of confidentiality and protection from reprisal. There is also a very strange part to the proposed model, which says that referrals for the public sector division, there's reference to parliamentarians self-referring to the KIC. And this sort of seems quite unrealistic and quite odd to me. It seems hard to imagine any circumstance where a parliamentarian or indeed a member of a parliamentarian's office is going to or a service provider is going to sort of put their hand up and say, look, I think I may have been involved in corrupt conduct and I think it might be criminal by nature, and I think I should be referred to the Commonwealth Integrity Commission for that to be investigated, and then potentially referred to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecution. I mean, that just seems, this reliance on a self-referral model seems quite bizarre, if nothing else. We've heard quite a bit from both Helen and Tony about public hearings and reporting, and again, the fact it's not consistent for these two divisions. And what sort of struck me is this, the argument that's been put forward that public hearings can trample and damage the reputation of parliamentarians, yet the risk of that happening seems to be quite acceptable for those in the law enforcement division, but indeed not for a parliamentarian or a member of their staff. So this sort of model that has been put forward, which seems to be premised on a we don't want the New South Wales ICAC approach to public hearings, it is really, I think, flawed, and it doesn't need to be this sort of black and white, public hearings versus no public hearings, or only for a select number of cases. And I believe it is possible to tread with care in this area, to balance the risks of reputational damage alongside the public's right to know. And indeed, as Helen indicated, the bill that she's put forward does provide opportunities for individuals to be exonerated. And I think it's fair to say that the benefits of public hearings in certain circumstances indeed outweigh some of the risks that have been proposed and put forward. I guess the other issue that I would touch on is this matter of reporting, which Tony made reference to. A lot of this will just never see the light of day. And there is a very worrying section within the legislation, section 239, part 7, for all the legislation geeks out there. But in this particular section, it makes clear that a report must not include any opinion or finding that is critical, either expressly or impliedly, of or a recommendation about a parliamentarian, the office of a parliamentarian, or a staff member of the office of a parliamentarian. So we just, it's very explicit that criticism cannot be made of parliamentarians. There is one aspect of the bill that I think has promise, is that it does cover, the jurisdiction does cover Commonwealth service providers and any subcontractors that they engage. But the benefits of that are then, quickly and regrettably not realised because of this two-division model. So again, the matter of, say, the Leffington Triangle, that would not be covered off unless a case of bribery or fraud could be proven, unless there was a criminal element to it. So a really missed opportunity to really not extend broad jurisdiction to service providers and subcontractors they engage. And then the other point that, just to pick up on this issue of independence and oversight a little bit more, is that it is proposed a joint parliamentary committee would be established, which is welcome. But the exposure draft appears to limit the Commission's access to and use of certified information at various points in time, and indeed during the investigations and hearings. And so it means that the Attorney General actually has very broad powers to issue certificates which declare disclosure of certain information is contrary to the public interest and therefore cannot be disclosed. And so just picking up on this point about independence and oversight and reporting that has been touched on tonight. And I think the final point would be that, interestingly, this issue of procurement that I wanted to touch on and reach in the narrow scope. So under the model, only 9 agencies, or just 21% of the public sector officials, would be covered by this broader definition, as Tony and Helen have made reference to. But for the other 79%, we've got this very narrow, it must reasonable suspicion of a criminal offence. So it means that there would be no scope to investigate, for example, agencies that are left out, such as the Department of Defence, whose procurement program was worth $38 billion in 2018 to 2019, amounts to 2/3 of all federal contracting. And just last year, another massive $270 billion was allocated for defence spending in the next 10 years. But if there is any, misconduct, wrongdoing, lobbying, undue influence, none of these matters associated with procurement would be covered off in these matters. And we know from our own global corruption barometer that for most Australian citizens, corruption doesn't just mean the criminal offences like theft and bribery and fraud, but they do see issues such as conflict of interest and undue influence, favouritism, nepotism, cronyism, as really being part of the slippery slope to corruption, and often going undetected. So I might leave it at that, but would encourage you all to put in a submission and to have a look on the TIA website for our blueprint for reform and our position paper, and to use the Beechworth Principles as a critique against the model that the government has put forward.
Thanks so much, Serena. Really thorough analysis that we've had today. So again, just thanks to all of you for your insights. We might just try and get through some questions, if that's okay with you. I can see one question. What's Dave Sharma's position on Helen's bill? Are you able to give us any insight on that, Helen?
Look, I haven't heard from Dave about my bill. So I don't know his position, and perhaps like many other government MPs, he's waiting on the consultation process to be complete on the government bill. But no, I don't know the answer.
I think some of the questions that I've been seeing are of a similar vein in terms of wanting to know who is likely to support your bill, Helen. So one person has asked whether other independents will support it, whether the Greens will support it, what Labor's position is, or any other support that you're aware of.
Yeah, thanks, Delia. So certainly my crossbench colleagues in the House of Representatives have given me their full support for the bill. The Labor Party have in principle. Haven't come out directly publicly saying they support Helen Haines' AFIC bill, but Mark Dreyfus was with me at that omnibus press conference that we had when in October when I introduced AFIC, as were Jackie Lambie, Pauline Hanson, and the Greens, and Bob Catter as well. So I have widespread support from my crossbench colleagues.
Do you think there's any likelihood that anyone from the Liberal Nationals would cross the floor to support it?
Look, it's a really big thing in Australia, unfortunately, to cross the floor on a bill, a major bill, a substantive piece of legislation. So I don't know, but what I do know is that there would be 2 steps to that process, and the first step is would be to vote with me and the opposition and the crossbench to allow debate. So that's the first step, to actually have a debate about the AFIC bill. It's tricky at the moment because, again, the government haven't introduced their bill to the Parliament. It's purely an exposure draft, and I imagine it's going to take quite a bit of time before that actually reaches the floor of Parliament. We may well have an election before then. So it's a difficult space in that sense. Again, I do this in good faith, and as I indicated in my slide, if this looks like dragging on, then in order to push along this and bring it to a more natural conclusion, then I would consider asking those MPs to cross the floor in order to bring on debate. But again, I can only ask that, and that's a difficult decision for them to make.
Another question, which we'll start with Helen, but if our other guests would like to have a comment as well, what advice would you have for us as to the best approach to engage our local member, which in Wentworth, as you know, is Dave Sharma, to try to influence them to support moving the process along at the very least, and ultimately supporting the bill?
So, Delia, I think for me, I don't care if it's a government bill or if it's my bill, so long as it's the right bill. So the key part for me is that if the government were to introduce their legislation, and one would hope that that's ultimately their intention, that it contains all the elements that align with the Beechworth Principles. So if that was about taking elements of the legislation I've put before the House and including it in their amended bill, I'd be delighted. So I guess the question for Dave is to engage in the conversation with him, to put the 2 bills side by side and ask him for his commentary on that, and that's where I would start.
Another question that's just come up is the average Wentworth voter would say they're for an integrity bill, but in the next breath they would buy the government line that there's too much red tape getting in the way of innovation and development. How would you counter that straw man argument?
I'm not sure what they would mean by that, that there's too much red tape getting in the way here. So have you got any idea what their thoughts are there, Delia?
No, I've read that off the chat, so that's all the background I have. But I assume that it's the arguments are routinely trotted out in response to a variety of innovative ideas.
Yeah.
One of which is that I assume what they're saying is that if there were a means of reviewing decisions on the basis of corruption, then that would be treated as a fetter to innovation and probably also the argument of economic growth, that it's actually stopping the process of policy moving forward because everything would be reviewed by the Integrity Commission. I think it's somebody speculating as to what a person of a different flavour might put forward as an argument so that we can formulate a response to it.
Well, again, I think it would be a misunderstanding of what the Integrity Commission is about. So the Integrity Commission is not a review body for innovation or new policies. It's a body to where there are robust referrals that are interrogated in a way that if there's spurious claims, if there's problematic referrals, they wouldn't even get past the first stage, essentially. So what we do know from international research is that good governance is in fact a pathway, and transparent processes in government is a pathway to innovation. In fact, you get better innovation if there's perceptions of a lack of integrity, if there's perceptions where there's low trust. That's a hamper to to innovation. Maybe Serena or Anthony may be able to comment on this one.
I was just going to make the comment that I think it's an interesting point, given, Helen, in your bill, there is, of course, also the call for a code of conduct, a parliamentary code of conduct at a federal level. And as we've seen time and time again, whilst we have ministerial standards at a federal level, they are rarely, and I don't, in fact, never have there actually been any actions in terms of applying the ministerial standards, Prime Minister's ministerial standards. And so I do think this issue around integrity and codes of conduct more broadly, and even if you sort of think about this, in a very broad sense, corruption being the abuse of entrusted power for personal and political gain, then I think these sort of the issues around, have come up again, certainly in a COVID environment, in terms of concerns around fast tracking approvals, for example, in order to stimulate, economic recovery in response to COVID. So I think it's a time when we do need to be particularly alert to broader issues around the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain, and that's why broader parliamentary standards and a code of conduct is necessary, and why we need a broader definition of what corruption is beyond just criminal matters, and to pick up on some of these grey issues that we've touched on tonight.
Thanks.
Can I just add a little bit there to what the others have said? It's interesting to note that the New South Wales legislation in the anti-corruption body makes it very clear that a breach of ministerial code of conduct can be corrupt conduct, provided it's serious. And I think that that's very sensible. That's exactly what we need at a federal level. To try and say, well, you can only be corrupt if you committed a criminal offence, is really pulling the shutters down on most of the conduct we've been complaining about over the last 4 or 5 years. And can I just add one other thing in relation to the previous question about Dave Sharma? I'm pleased to say that our little National Integrity Committee, it's a group of retired judges, both men and women, who are very interested in this issue. We've invited Dave to come along to a meeting with us in a couple of weeks' time, and I understand that he's probably keen to come. So we'll have an opportunity to push him to support Helen Haines' legislation, or at least the principles behind her legislation. And finally, may I ask rhetorically, perhaps Helen can answer this, is Craig Kelly likely to cross the floor, Helen?
That's pretty cheeky, Anthony.
I'll assume that's rhetorical. Anthony, while we have you, a question's come through. Has the government responded to the Centre for Public Integrity's analysis of their exposure draft?
No.
Okay. Another question, which is probably for Helen, is there any connection between your bill and limits on political funding and lobbying and transparency in relation to lobbying, or are they separate issues? I assume that means, would those sort of activities potentially meet the test for what would be what would come in front of a federal Integrity Commission under Helen Haines's bill?
That's a really interesting question, and I would think that should there be a breach of a ministerial code of conduct that indicated that there was impropriety around a political donation, or indeed if we had a parliamentary code of conduct in the same way, then potentially there could be a referral through the Integrity Commission. It's not explicitly setting out to deal with what is a problem in our democracy with political donations. That would require some different legislation. But I would think, and again, I'm not a lawyer, perhaps Anthony or Serena may be able to answer this, but if there had been a breach of code that indicated a money trail that was not for its intended purposes, then perhaps. So Serena or Anthony, what would your thoughts be on that?
Well, I think the broader the definition of corrupt conduct, the more likely it'll pick up that sort of misbehaviour. For example, the New South Wales legislation, again, enables the body to investigate any conduct of any person, so it doesn't have to be a public official, that adversely affects or could adversely affect, directly or indirectly, the honest or impartial exercise of public administration. And I would think that immediately catches up a large donation if it's given in the expectation that a favour will follow from politicians. That's exactly what we want, really.
Yep. Another question. A participant who says the matter is urgent. How does the looming election present opportunities for elevating this issue, and how can Voices of Wentworth and those who have joined today help?
Well, perhaps I'll kick off. I think if we get into an election period and the government have not delivered an Integrity Commission bill, that was an election promise from 2019. I think that's a key area that Voices for Wentworth and indeed any citizen across the nation would have to ask the question: why did you not fulfil your election promise? So again, there's a lot of speculation about when the next election may be, but here we are coming into February, and the consultation process on an exposure draft is just wrapping up. I guess the government would need to introduce that bill pretty rapidly in order for debate to ensue and for any amendments to be made, for negotiations with the Senate before an election. So again, I would say hold all of us to account, hold the government to account on that promise.
Well, I think the political danger is that the government will introduce the bill in its current form. It'll then go to the Senate, get knocked back in the Senate, and the government will say before the election, well, we did our best and you mob up there held us up. It's not our fault. That's politically you're going to get a bit of spin, I think. But all the more reason for Voices of Wentworth and everybody else to get in there and say, stop the spin, please embrace the issues and let's deal with them. It's so important.
I think there's also a risk too that I absolutely agree, Tony, around that political scenario that may well play out. I think also, and Helen touched on it earlier, it's would not be unlikely that the rationale for delays are put down to the need for the government to respond quickly and swiftly to the COVID pandemic. We've certainly seen interesting situations where other important pieces of legislation have been delayed, such as new legislation with regards to amendments to the foreign bribery bill and the introduction of new offences there. That sort of has kept being delayed on the grounds that the government's too busy tackling COVID and the response they've needed. But of course, then we've seen other pieces of legislation pushed through very, very quickly and using different forms of lawmaking and discretionary powers to get legislation pushed through where that's appropriate, or where it's considered appropriate, and in the interest of the government, and of course in some cases where particular types of lawmaking that don't allow for any amendments, in fact, to be made after they've gone through. So we're seeing a rise in this sort of lawmaking that can happen when it suits.
Thanks very much, Serena. Kath, there's been a number of comments, but that's the end of the questions that have come through the chat.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. We can continue talking for a bit if that's what people would like to do, and I don't know whether other participants would like to jump in and ask questions at this stage. I'm entirely in your hands, panelists.
Kath, I'm afraid I will have to bow out. I have to be somewhere else shortly. So I want to thank you again for the invitation and thank everyone for their participation and their questions. And I really encourage you to keep up your great work in participating in your democracy the way you are. It's so encouraging. To people like me and certainly to my fellow independents, but to the Parliament more broadly, that the people of Wentworth are so engaged in thinking about things that matter, that they're getting together like this and having these kinds of debates. So all power to your arm. Thanks so much. And thank you to you, Serena and Tony.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, everyone. We'll wrap it up there, I think. Watch this space for more Voices of Wentworth town halls, and we've got some interesting things happening over the next few weeks and months. And so we'll be sending out details about that to our mailing list and on our website and Facebook and Twitter as well. So keep in touch, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kath.
Thank you.
Thank you.